Pax Vobiscum. Happy, it's actually Sunday, but I'm going to release this as part of my monologue series for Monday Monologues. But we are diving into D&C, the LDS Doctrine D&C Section 2, as part of a continuation of that series. And some of the things that happened actually at sacrament meetings. I went to a new ward. I'm visiting a different ward here in Corpus Christi. And so coincidentally, we had some beautiful things line up or aligned with going over section 2. So we're going to tie that in today. But going into this, I'm going to go through with different layers, and we're going to introduce different things that I got out of it and just reflect on how that can apply to everyday experiences and what I took out of it. And first off, going into it, just looking at it from an epistemological perspective. And what that means is, hey, what's actually written here? Like, what words were selected? What letters were punctuated or capitalized? Where were commas placed? Grammar, things like that, because that plays a significant role in how a reader orients themselves when they read a text. And so before I get into everything, just overview looking at it, if you look at all the different Doctrine and Covenant sections, this one, and in particular some other ones correlated to the concept of priesthood, you'll notice a noticeable difference between the length of the text itself. And if you look at section 2, every time they have the introduction, it says that this is an extract from Joseph Smith's history. Oftentimes people automatically assume that, and we've talked about this previously, that everything written in here is a revelation. That's not necessarily the case. And the introduction paragraph orients the reader to a perspective or giving them some background in how they're supposed to ideally read the text. And looking at this, this section only has three verses, 3 sentences in it. And that's rather remarkable, right? It gets you curious about it because that tells you innately, hey, just because it's short doesn't mean that it's irrelevant. That means most likely there's a whole can of worms that's packed into there that's hidden in plain sight. So we're going to go through that first and foremost. And looking at it, so just looking at the introduction, it says an extract from Joseph Smith's history related to the words of Angel Moroni to Joseph Smith the prophet, and it gives the date and it goes into that. It says Moroni was the last of a long line of historians who made the record that is now before the world as the Book of Mormon. To me, what is that orienting to the reader and reading this, being like, hey, this is something that someone significant said. This plays into a bigger role, a bigger context, and this is the background of where that level of significance and meaning first arose from. These words aren't necessarily attributed to Joseph Smith. They are and they aren't, right? Because in here it says, it basically introduces Moroni as being the spokesperson or the originator of these words, this message, and it's been passed forward through history, and it came to Joseph Smith to be able to share to other people. But with that, the word extract, that got me curious because I was like, okay, if it's an extract, that means there's more, and I love when there's more. And so I actually went looking, and let me pull it up. If you go to the church's website, and this is what I love about the Latter-day Saint paradigm or system of belief, it's very organized and it's very detail-oriented, and it necessarily presents different layers of unlocking new aha moments for an individual based on where you're at and whatnot. And so for this, if you go actually to the website and you go into like the study materials, you'll see a different orientation in the introduction than you do in the printed book for like the masses. In this version, in the introduction, it talks about a lot about Moroni. It mentions those types of things, and it automatically creates a level of meaning and assumption for the reader. However, when you go to the next layer and you go searching for that excerpt or seeing what else is available, you have a different introduction, a different orientation, a different level that's being analyzed or perceived or presented. And that's what makes these texts so beautiful. And again, that depth becomes obvious. And if you go online, you'll see again, it it emphasizes that this is an excerpt, right? In the actual printed text, it calls it an extract. On the online version, it calls it an excerpt. That shows a consistency, saying, hey, there's still more here. We're giving you a small piece of it, but there's still more. And if you're curious, you can find it elsewhere. But this one talks more about the literal logistics behind how this text even came to be. And it starts off by saying, handwriting of James Mulholland and Robert B. Thompson, 61 pages in Joseph Smith history. It gives the date. And it says, includes redactions, use marks, and archival marking. For more information, this is the important part, see the source note. And it gives the reference and it gives the actual citation of where this came from. What that does is it allows someone that's reached a level where they're desiring more knowledge, they're desiring more understanding, more in-depth research, learning, exploration of the concepts that are meaningful to them, they can find it and it shows it. There's a small little trail there, right? In here it says, see the source note, and it provides a link to it, the Joseph Smith Papers website. But the historical introduction, it again says it's an excerpt from the history of the church. For more information, you can find it here. That is very different than what is written in the actual book, what is printed here. And there's a reason for that, right? Because this book is necessarily the triple threat. It's meant for people, mass publication, like easy level of orientation, understanding. Once you've gotten past that and perhaps you're more curious, hey, now we're getting into more detail. We're getting into more subtlety. We're having more information be introduced. And then if you click on the Joseph Smith Papers website, you go full on into the weeds. You have access to everything where you yourself have the capacity to interpret the words, to read them, to find meaning and explore that and discover them for yourself instead of being given to you in a nice, neat, clean template. And so that's just looking at the introduction there. Going into the 3 verses here, let's just break it down. So the first verse, it says, behold, I will reveal unto you the priesthood by the hand of Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. I actually paused there because I was like, okay, I mentioned it previously because you see in, I think, D&C 10, or was it 10 or 13? 10? No, it's 13. You'll see that's the next time you see the priesthood being referenced or having more detail revealed. And that talks about the Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthood, but you see no mention of Elijah. And innately, people could at surface level say, hey, haha, here's an automatic discrepancy, therefore it's not true. And I would argue, no, it doesn't necessarily mean that, because it just innately hints at you, hey, Elijah, the concept of Elijah, the priesthood, and the LDS perspective, that piece is symbolic or literal to another aspect of the concept of priesthood and how the Latter-day Saints utilize that. And so it's easy, again, to say, hey, like, this is an automatic discrepancy. But then a curious mind or someone that's a little bit more aware would be like, where does this emerge? Where does this piece eventually come out? And if you look, it actually does eventually come out in section 110, and we'll go into that at the Kirtland Temple, I believe. Kirkland Temple? Anyways, looking at verse 1, I looked at that because I said, why Elijah? There's countless of prophets, right? There's some from the Old Testament, there's some from the New Testament, there's some from different religions, they're all over the place. Why was Elijah selected? What's so special about Elijah? And even if you look at Judaism, there's actually a cup, Elijah's cup, that they have for the Passover Seder, that they set aside specifically for him, because it says, according to the story, we'll do a background, Elijah was one of the few humans on this planet that supposedly, or is attributed to, not actually physically dying and being ascended out into the atmosphere in some capacity, and there's no real record, mention, or documentation showing that there was a confirmed or witnessed physical death that happened. And so automatically assumed, hey, because he left still living, there must be a place he went, therefore he's probably coming back, type thing. And I believe later on, Malachi prophesies and states that, hey, Elijah's coming back in some capacity. And so you see that in the monotheistic religions. You see Elijah the prophet being very influential in different aspects of the religion. Again, Judaism has the Elijah cup that they set for the Passover Seder. And in LDS doctrine, right, he's the one that brings back and is gonna be restoring the priest or reveal the priesthood by the hand of Elijah. What capacity the priesthood's going to be revealed, it's up for uncertainty at this point in time, because this was written in, was it 1823? With that, though, we're gonna jump real quick because we have this in 1823. In section 1, that was actually written in 1831, so that happened later on. But if we go back to section 1, verse 8, it states, and verily I say unto you, that they who go forth, bearing these tidings unto the inhabitants of the earth, to them is power given to seal both on earth and in heaven. We go to section 2, we see mention, again, verse 1, behold, I will reveal unto you the priesthood by the hand of Elijah the prophet. What does that mean? Okay, where does that come into? Because we have a tie-in in the intro saying that power is given to seal on both heaven and on earth for them that bear tidings. But tidings of what? There's no specificity. It's left ambiguous on purpose. Jump forward to actual 1836, and you see in section 110, verses 14, 15, and 16, you see a repetition, you see a correlation to section 2, which again occurred in 1823. So a significant amount of time has happened. And it says this, it hints at it, that therefore the keys of this dispensation are committed into your hands. The keys to what? And if you look at the LDS doctrine, they actually define the keys, let me see, as the keys, the sealing keys. And that's very significant for sealing on both heaven and earth, according to the interpretations, which again plays into section 1, which says, whoever brings forth bearing tidings unto the inhabitants of the earth, to them is given this sealing power, which is again established in section 2 to be interpreted as the priesthood by the hand of Elijah the prophet. So you see this beautiful tie in there, but again, you have this beautiful tension in the text. And by tension, I don't mean argument, I mean an opportunity to unlock greater depth of understanding. And so when you have these pieces that seem to conflict with one another, that's a hint to oneself that, hey, there's more information that's available to make this all become a coherent narrative. And you see that there because it's stating that Elijah the prophet is going to reveal the priesthood. And what does that mean? It symbolically means the power to seal in both heaven and earth. That's again touched on in section 1 and section 110. And then it comes down to, well, who has the power to do this then? And if you look actually at the Joseph Smith Papers website, they go into talking about the priesthood and what that represents. And it states in the second sentence, no specialized training was required in order to get the priesthood confirmed. It's just the symbolic ritual is given, and then it says no specialized training was required. So again, that correlates to section 1 saying, hey, as long as you're bearing inhabitants to the inhabitants of the earth, you have the authority of what is determined to be the priesthood sealing keys that Elijah revealed later on. That is in 110 at the Kirkland Temple. Anyways, I thought that was beautiful. So we're going into verse 2, and it says, and he shall plant in the hearts of the children the promises made to the fathers, and the hearts of the children shall turn to their fathers. I love this verse because actually it was ironic in the sacrament meeting today. We had hymn number 1022, And the first verse of it starts out by saying, "A marvelous work has begun to come forth among all the children of men." Talk about a beautiful tie-in to section 2 of the D&C, verse 2. "And he shall plant in the hearts of the children the promises made to the fathers, and the hearts of the children shall turn to their fathers." Right? Beautiful tie-in. You can take something that was given a long time ago to something that coincidentally happened today when I was coincidentally happened to make this video. And that shows how this text still remains relevant and is still utilized in song, in everyday life, in ways to remember and create that depth of meaning, create that purpose, create that sense of identity for someone that's navigating their life. With that, and then verse 3, it goes into the kind of, I wouldn't say the routine story arc, but the very predictable way that people understand stories or create meaning from things. You start off by having a verse 1 is a sense of authority being established. Verse 2 talks about how that action is going to come about. And verse 3 says, if this didn't occur, if this wasn't in place, what would it look like? What kind of alternative perspective would or outcome may potentially occur? And that says, if it were not so, the whole earth would be utterly wasted at his coming. What does that mean? It leaves it up to, the imagination. Utterly wasted. Does that mean that, like, perhaps, littering's going to be rampant? A discrepancy between the rich and the poor, right, is going to be evident. There's going to be a large gap between socioeconomic conditions between the masses and civilization at large. What does utterly wasted mean? Right? Does it mean a huge sense of confusion and misunderstanding? Or does it mean a sense of division, of literal physical wars and violence? It could be open to so many things again. So with that, I did want to notice, though, because, again, this was printed for the masses. And if you look at the version online, because this is an extract, if you go back to the original source document, there were things purposely left out to provide the meat and bones, the nitty-gritty of those three sentences out of like 60-some pages, out of thousands of pages, honestly, if you look at all the record. But with that, I wanted to highlight what was left out and what made the editorial cut. And it's very subtle things, but it just leaves room for interpretation. It leaves room for assumption of meaning to arise or novel application to be applied that is relevant in a modern era versus just staying stuck as a data point from the 1800s, if that makes sense. And so looking at that, the things that were left out from the actual that made the print version of the D&C section 2 were these words. And again, he quoted the 5th verse thus. Then it goes into this, made it into the D&C. "Behold, I will reveal unto you the priesthood by the hand of Elijah the prophet for the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord." Then this next sentence was left out too. He also quoted the next verse differently. "And he shall plant in the hearts of children," capital C, not a lowercase c, because in the D&C, the printed version, children has been lowercased. "The promises made to the fathers, and the hearts of the children shall turn to their fathers." Verse 3, "If it were not so, the whole earth shall be utterly wasted at his coming." So the things that were left out were the two sentences, or basically the only things that are left out, were, "And again he quoted the 5th verse thus." Then the phrase, "He also quoted the next verse differently." And then children went from capitalized to lowercase. And those things seem like irrelevant. Oh, obviously that makes it easier to read or whatnot. But what do those things do? What do those things orient to the reader? What information do they potentially provide? And what really stuck out to me was the verse, or the words, "He also quoted the next verse differently." The word differently comes about. So that is an open acknowledgement that, hey, the literal words that were being recited were recited using different words. Why is that? What was that doing? Was it providing more clarity? Was it providing more substance? Why was it done differently? Because oftentimes people think when you're quoting a source, you have to vote verbatim, keep it at its core. But then all of a sudden, we have evidence in the record that acknowledges the verse was said differently. It was presented differently, almost as if it was like an update from a text that's ancient and thousands of years old. And so again, that's pretty common, and you would expect that from within at least the LDS framework, because that's embedded, that revelation, that more understanding gets unlocked as time progresses, as more maturity arises in society, in the individual, in the circumstances and situations regarding receiving more clarity and insight. And so I love that it openly acknowledges that even in the text it says he also quoted the next verse differently. It wasn't like, hey, remember these things that I gave to you guys thousands of years ago. It's, I'm going to take this same thing, I'm going to update it into a language or words that is more applicable or understood for this era. And then we're going to go forth and continue that type of rhetoric, that type of logic, that type of capacity to apply that type of lens to thinking and looking at these texts and making them relevant to the modern day without still losing the fundamental message that is trying to be conveyed. And that does that beautifully. As far as the word children going from capitalized to lowercase, unsure where that happens from or where that came from. You could say it was just because things back then were handwritten. It could be a iffiness of, hey, like, was this actually capitalized? Was this lowercase? What was that scribble there? Things like that are hard to read, especially back in the old days in the 1800s. You look at that cursive print. You look at these old documents that are faded. They've got stains on them. It can be hard to translate these things. And so that could potentially have been an editorial process where it was capitalized and it was chosen to be lowercased again. Who knows? Or it could have been done on purpose, right? To enunciate this one letter. The letter C was capitalized here and then it goes to lowercase c over here. Why is that? We can do all sorts of interpretations. You can make a whole sort of whimsy just going down that path, which we're not going to necessarily do. But further than that, I just want to look at, why is this included? What function, right? We have the literal things. Like, first off, the very basic level I would say is, can you read the words and understand them? Sure, we can do that all day. If you can read words, you've made it past a certain threshold of understanding. But then next becomes, how do we extract or extrapolate meaning onto these things? How do we assign meaning onto the words that were chosen? And what function, what type of outcomes were those words chosen for in order to incite within society, within the individual, within different systems of thought? And with that, if you look at the concept of the priesthood, why is that something? What function does that serve? And on the face value, you can say, oh, the priesthood serves to be able to do these types of things. You can make a list and be like, this is the function of the priesthood. And I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, what does that word, what does that label, what does that identity do for a human being that carries that and embodies that type of assumption correlated to that word? Because if you think about it, priesthood, in at least the religious context, if you utilize that term, for instance, in the civilian world, it's not going to mean much. I would argue like a translation of the function of what it appears the priesthood serves at for an everyday purpose is it provides a source of self-confidence, of ability to navigate discomfort, to go like lean into uncertainty and your anxieties and recognize that you have the capacity to navigate those situations. And what allows that navigation to occur? Well, it's because you fully are embodying and believing, putting all your trust and faith into the assumptions correlated to the word priesthood. And so oftentimes people, that sort of word, yes, it serves a very specific role within the church and that framework, but how does that translate outside of that into everyday experiences? Would someone expect someone with priesthood authority? How would you expect them to behave? Would you be able to look at someone and say, they're someone that most likely has priesthood authority because of look at their behaviors, look at how they carry themselves, even like looking at their shoe rack. Are their shoes organized in their home? Do they pick up trash that they see next to receptacles that are there? Do they wash their hands? Do they use hand sanitizer? Do their clothes have wrinkles in it? Does their hair look combed? Is their garage clean and organized? If you opened up their dresser, what would it look like? Would you expect someone with priesthood authority to have a neatly organized and meticulous drawer and these subtle nuances? Or would you expect to open it up and be shocked by what you see because it's disorganized and looks haphazard? That's what I mean by what does that label, what does it do for a person? And in an everyday experience, it empowers people to feel like they can tackle the impossible. And the impossible, again, spells I'm possible for a reason. It's not that it can't be done, it's that do you have the capacity, the belief, the effort, the willingness to struggle to learn something novel and become better for it, even though it's very uncomfortable, even though it's hard, even though there's resistance, all sorts of things could go wrong. What capacity, what type of behaviors are you demonstrating that correlate or are coherent with that title of priesthood? And so, from that aspect, priesthood carries a different meaning. It's not something I would say that's meant for a distinct few. It's an identity, it's a function, it's a purpose that doesn't necessarily have to invoke the label of priesthood because everyday people practice the concepts or the behaviors that are correlated to someone who has that type of confidence and self agency and discernment capacity while navigating everyday experiences. On a very simple level, right? If I were to correlate these different concepts, the Aaronic priesthood, for instance, it's the more fundamental layer. Can you be trusted with greater responsibility? Like having a car. We do this in the US government system. We allow people to start driving at 16. Why don't we do it earlier? Why don't we do it later, right? So in Europe, for instance, they don't drive till 21. There's a difference. They apply the concepts correlated to priesthood authority in different age levels and groups, just depending on what they categorize as a mature level of being able to handle more responsibility. And if you look at that, you can again correlate that to, like in the US, for instance, you could argue that like the Melchizedek priesthood or that concept, that level of being able to navigate greater responsibility, greater opportunity, more diverse environments arises when the US government allows someone to have access legally to alcohol at the age of 21. Versus in Europe, they allow that level of responsibility to emerge at age 16. Again, that's a flip flop, but it shows neither one's wrong. It's just different approaches to applying concepts of the priesthood, of Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthood, of these different layers to show, to teach those discernment, to start introducing more depth and nuance to being able to navigate society and life in a beneficial way that not only benefits the individual, but leads to a meaningful contribution to society and civilization as a whole. And so that's just some of the things I saw in there. I think oftentimes the label of priesthood is not recognized when someone doesn't utilize that term. And I would argue that the term itself isn't needed because the actions themselves demonstrate it, and natural assumption of meaning starts to be correlated the more data points you get. Someone can claim, for instance, to be responsible all day long and say they practice self-agency, but if they're 200 pounds and their credit score is like 600, you would be like, hey, I'm just kind of questioning what depth and weight of meaning the word responsible has when you correlate it to yourself. You know what I mean? The evidence suggests that there may be a differing perspective that perhaps is included in that situation versus correlating the full depth of the word responsible in that situation, for example.